Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I want to first of all start by thanking Environmental Leader for this opportunity. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I think we put together a terrific program. We are going to talk about the demystification of PFAS challenges in the oil and gas industry. This presentation really started several months ago when we were talking internally about all of the concerns our respective clients brought to us. Some of the questions are presented there for you, and it really started us thinking about how we can holistically approach some of the challenges that might be relevant in your world, in your workplace. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is James McCormick. I am the sector lead for oil and gas markets at Montrose Environmental. I've been in this role a number of months now, having come from the emergency response world where PFAS was something that we had to deal with related to fires and those sorts of things. Now let me introduce our panel of experts. Martha, would you please introduce yourself first?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Martha Meyer. I'm the PFAS program leader for Montrose. My background is primarily on the analytical side. I am the former owner and lab director of Vista Analytical Laboratory. We first started doing some R&D on PFAS back in 2007. So I've had over 15 years of working with and studying these compounds. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Angie Perez. I'm a senior toxicologist and certified industrial hygienist with CTEH, which is part of the Montrose Environmental Group family. I am located in Portland, Oregon, and my primary work involves development of simulation studies and litigation, expert work revolving PFAS, cannabis, and asbestos.
Steve.
Hello, everyone. Steve Pepper. I'm a recent hire with CTEH. I just recently retired from industry. More than 30 years in the midstream, downstream, and upstream sectors. I've been working with PFAS on the performance side for about 8 years. So lots of testing, lots of research on the replacements for PFAS foams.
Good morning, Nicole.
Thanks for joining, everyone. My name is Nicole Balea. My background is in chemical and environmental engineering, and I'm with ECT2, where we're excited to tackle the challenge of treating PFAS in complex water matrices.
And David.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Bly. I'm a principal chemist with Environmental Standards. I am a consulting chemist, and I have consulted on PFAS issues for about 20 years.
Thank you. Martha, we'll go ahead and start the presentation with you. And the urgency seems to have grown recently with PFAS. What can you attribute that to, and how can you share that with our community?
Yes, James, thank you. Things have really ramped up over the past summer. I want to point out some of the impacts that will directly relate to the oil and gas industry. And first and foremost, we have to start with the proposal to designate PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA. There are direct impacts, such as the requirement to report acute releases at or above a pound in a 24-hour period, and also the designation of these compounds as a hazardous substances under the Department of Transportation regulations. But also, this brings significant liability considerations for sites where PFAS were used or identified and owners of historic remediation sites. So concerns for the oil and gas industry are primarily related to the use of AFFF, aqueous film forming foam. There are potential releases during storage, during transportation, fire training, or an actual fire incident. So Steve Pepper will be discussing AFFF later in more detail in the presentation. There are also potential for PFAS in certain types of production chemicals, such as hydraulic fluids or surfactants that could also have potential liability, may have to discuss this with your suppliers. NPDES permit. So some facilities have already seen PFAS added to their monitoring requirements. EPA will be adding more later in the year after EPA method 1633 is officially published. So this will incorporate the analysis possibility in wastewater for 40 PFAS. And we'll hear more about this from David Bly later in the webinar. The new health advisories will also affect the industry more indirectly. We've all heard about how low these are, 4 parts per quadrillion for PFOA. These are not measurable limits. They're not enforceable, but they will impact regulations and limits coming down the road, such as the MCLs. These are the maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. These will be proposed later this fall. They're expected to be fairly low, and any exceedances may lead to site investigations and characterizations upstream from the sites. And finally, TRI. EPA recently added additional PFAS to the reporting list, and more are expected to be added over time. So EPA is definitely demonstrating its commitment to following through on the expectations laid out in the PFAS strategic roadmap. So thank you, James.
Thank you, Martha. Angie, you have a unique perspective coming from a toxicology background who also happens to have a certified industrial hygienist certification. What do you tell us, or what can you share with us regarding the program development and human health exposures?
Yeah, thanks, James. I appreciate it. It's a good question because if you think about the health effects for PFAS exposure, we can first look to what EPA has designated in the past 20 years as the most sensitive endpoints. Their most recent publication was, of course, the interim health advisories in 2022, published this June, for most sensitive health effects for non-cancer and cancer endpoints. And I've listed a select group of PFAS that are commonly detected in environmental matrices. And it's from this list that we derive the most sensitive endpoint that led us to the interim health advisory of the 4 parts per quadrillion, as Martha mentioned. And that was based on a non-cancer endpoint for decreased vaccine response in a specific human population. This is the Faroe Islands children population study. Of note, in addition to these health effects, if you want to click to the next, so there are other reported health effects that have come into play in litigation regarding PFAS. So cases in which I've been involved, I've seen allegations of increased cholesterol, and of course, increased cholesterol, if you think back to 2008, that was part of the endpoint with the C8 panel conclusions. Increased cholesterol was found to have a probable association with PFAS exposure. However, stomach cancer and lung cancer were not part of those C8 conclusions. And so everyone in this audience knows there is active litigation with claims that PFAS caused stomach cancer and lung cancer. So this is important for all of us and for the oil and gas industry because we want to protect our workforce, okay? And we want to protect their families as well. And so one way to do that is to develop a documented and robust PFAS workplace safety program. And so I have outlined 3 ways that you can do this. So this development of PFAS safety program can typically starts with a job safety analysis or a job hazard analysis. You may have heard it referred to as. This involves figuring out where in your process people may be exposed, your workforce may be exposed to PFAS, whether it's high touch points, whether the people are part of a fire training program, whether they're cleaning filters as part of your suppression lines, etc. You'll want to know where folks may be exposed to PFAS. And then you can also take some IH data, some industrial hygiene-based data to actually quantify where folks may be exposed. And this is important because being able to quantify exactly how much people are exposed to helps prevent utilizing default assumptions later on down the road. So EPA is part of their TSCA program. Any products that are going to have PFAS in them, you're going to have to go through an exposure assessment. As these new NIPDES permits and other PFAS regulations are ratified, you're probably going to have to go through this exercise of an exposure assessment. And so rather than assuming the default that someone's exposed for 8 hours a day, 250 days a year, it's better to know at which points for the specific duration of time that they're exposed, so you can come up with an accurate estimate of exposure. And then, of course, develop a written best practices and procedures plan. This is a good way to help with training for your employees, and then also to have this written plan to avoid liability in the future as well. And I think there's a couple more boxes here. One is risk communication, and second is biomonitoring. I'll talk about risk communication in a bit because it's one of, I think it's a long forgotten and often overlooked but critically important component of developing these PFAS safety programs. So once you develop it, if you don't communicate it effectively to your workforce, it essentially is meaningless. So there's some tricks that I can recommend that have worked in the past with large companies for effective risk communication. I also included biomonitoring here. However, there are a lot of challenges with biomonitoring. One of them is that, as we know, PFAS are everywhere in the environment. They're ubiquitous in the environment, right? And so we get exposed from a wide variety of sources, from consumer products, possibly from water, from air potentially. So there are a lot of different sources. And so it's really difficult to discern from where the PFAS come if your workforce is involved in a biomonitoring program. And the next slide has some exposure limits. So as you can tell, there's a very short list. These exposure limits are all for PFOA. So ACGIH has a TLV for the ammonium salt of PFOA. It's an 8-hour time-weighted average, and it's 0.01 mgs per meter cubed. The Department of Energy has protective action criteria for a 1-hour exposure at levels that are extraordinarily high. We rarely see these in a workplace. And then OSHA has not developed a permissible exposure limit yet. Curiously, it'll be interesting to see what OSHA does, because as part of the development of a permissible exposure limit, you also have to evaluate feasibility, which includes an economic assessment. So I'll be curious to see what OSHA comes up with. And the next slide, I'm going to dive right into the risk communication. This is sort of one of my favorite areas, and there are several things you can do. So as we talked about, understand your potential exposures by job and by task too. So it's not just operators, maybe it's operators when they're doing a particular task within your facility. You want to emphasize compliance for your workforce. So for example, here's 3 narratives that you could use. 1, company complies with all appropriate regulations, hard stop. Regulations in place are protective of public health and the environment. And 3, company will be transparent in communicating regulatory compliance. So these are ways you can emphasize your compliance, and you want to be consistent with this messaging as well. I think that's down to point 3. Share the results from your sampling and your risk assessment. And 4, you can make time for questions from workers and their families. This is something that I've seen happen quite a bit, where if you, in the meetings in which I've participated involving risk communications with very large workforce, some of the hardest questions come from their loved ones or their household contacts. And so you really want to make time for their families and make sure that the risk communications include others close to your workforce. And then, of course, here's the consistency. Reinforce that messaging again and again. It should be the same consistent messaging. And that messaging is about compliance, protection, and transparency. One other part for risk communication that people also forget too is that you want to be able to communicate risks to the communities in which you serve too, especially for a group of chemicals like PFAS, where they're so widespread, and release of chemicals often involves offsite transport in some way, shape, or form. And so there are some best practices here that we can use for communicating risk to a community. So have a plan. So a simple message composed of limited parts should be the foundation for all of your community risk communications. Every official interaction should include some of the limited parts, your simple messaging with all concerned stakeholders. Key components of the communication plan should include the concepts of compliance, protection, and transparency, like we talked about earlier. Start small. What I mean by this is that I recommend addressing smaller groups in order to maintain some level of control over the discussion. And that way you can adjust the messaging tactics as needed. Next, grab a partner. I suggest to engage a partner in communication efforts. And you may find some hesitancy finding a partner in local, state, and federal agencies. They may be reluctant to become involved with this process. However, there is usually some sort of an opportunity to convince some agencies to participate through existing relationships. Also, become familiar. So we know that emotions can run high during any crisis, and a way to help ease any big emotions that are coming from your audience is to be a familiar face, to be a consistent and familiar face with consistent messaging. This way we can prevent the condition known as outrage fatigue, where people are just tired of being outraged for so long over a problem where they feel powerless to control. So becoming a familiar face can be a comfort in that scenario. And lastly, be consistent. So consistency in messaging is critical for an audience to understand what is being relayed to them, and repeating this similar or identical messaging can overcome this, as well as to provide some kind of a sense of familiarity to your audience. And I think that was my last slide, and I appreciate the questions, James. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. I appreciate all of the detail you put into your slides and setting up a program. Good afternoon, Steve. Martha started out our presentation earlier talking about the renewed sense of urgency that we feel with PFAS legislation. And then Angie followed that up with an exposure monitoring program and communications plan. You bring a unique perspective, having been on the industry side and having to have large quantities of PFAS and foam at your facilities. What can you tell us, and what can you tell our audience about some of the replacement and some of the efficacy of alternatives?
Thanks, James, for the great question. So whenever I have talked to colleagues about transition from AFFF to a synthetic fluorine-free foam, the primary question I always get is, do fluorine-free firefighting foams work? And that's usually followed up with, which foam should I choose? And so I can talk a little bit about the industry-driven performance testing program that's been in place since 2015, and talk about the different performance characteristics. just like with the short chain C6 AFFFs, synthetic fluorine-free foams have limited performance experience on real incidents. One of the other challenges for the synthetic fluorine-free foams is different manufacturers approach the problem with different chemistry to find a replacement. Whereas in the last 10 to 15 years, AFFF has been very similar in chemistry across all manufacturers. The replacement foams have approached the problem a little differently depending on manufacturer. So understanding what the chemistry approach is key to identifying which foams work better than others and which ones you may want to choose. There's been a very large end user driven research and testing program for replacement foams through an organization co-op called LASTFIRE. LASTFIRE stands for Large Atmospheric Storage Tank Fires, and it's all about fire hazard management. In addition, mil-spec and aviation users have been doing research through the Department of Defense's ESTCP and CERTIP programs. Next slide, Miles. So LASTFIRE is a consortium of international oil companies. As you can see, many different oil companies from around the world have come together to participate in this LASTFIRE research, in addition to associate members from different chemical and equipment manufacturers, and one logo we don't have on there was CTH. We recently joined the co-op in Borger, Texas on crude oil. So from 2014 through 2019, LASTFIRE started doing small scale simulated tank fire with critical application rates, moved to look at a little larger fire pans and spill fire at critical application rates, larger real life application rates, and then even longer flow application rates at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Have looked at subsurface, self-expanding foam, vapor suppression, different hybrid medium expansion application methods, obstructions in spill fire testing, and they've tested different foams, different nozzles, application methods, rates, different fuels, including crude oil, and different pre-burns, along with salt water and fresh water. Go ahead. Then in 2021, LASTFIRE through the end of 2019 and 2020 went in with Jessup in France and built a real large scale test pit. So this pit is 6 meters wide by 50 meters long, and we were able to do over a couple of weeks 22 different tests on 6 different synthetic fluorine-free foams, blinded, and all of the tests were discharged through commercially available equipment into a landing zone that had about 15 centimeters of fuel depth, and then the rest of the pit had 5 centimeters of fuel depth. And the pit was broken up into thirds with weirs so that we could have that deeper fuel in the landing zone, and then enough fuel on the rest of the pit to continue to burn. Tests were completed both conventionally aspirating and compressed air foam systems through pores and monitors. And then the last test we did was we successfully completed it using just a standard combination nozzle, no aspiration tube, for a real semi-aspirated application. Which is very similar to most of the equipment used in large-scale tank fire scenarios around the world. All tests were at or below NFPA 11 application rates and discharge times. And in France, all the tests used gasoline as the fuel. In fact, we burned about 80,000 gallons of gasoline over 2 weeks. This year in 2022, we had several questions around crude oil and how the new foams would respond to crude oil. And so we went to Borger, Texas, and we were able to go ahead, go to the next slide, Miles, and start the video. So in Borger, we did 19 different tests. On screen, you'll see 2 of the tests. One was at half of the NFP application rate, or 0.08 gallons per minute per square foot. Expansion ratio was 3.2 to 1, so a very realistic expansion ratio. And then the bottom one is 8 gallons per minute per square foot, or 0.16 application rate. Same expansion ratio. So in this testing, the tank is 50 square meters of surface area. We had about 6 feet of crude depth. We used Oklahoma State University to provide thermal monitoring of the crude oil inside the tank. So there was a tree of thermocouples throughout the liquid, and we were able to measure the hot zone development of the crude oil as it was burning. We used a 30-minute pre-burn for all of the tests. As you can see on the bottom there, we did use some external nozzles, and we did get some froth over in different tests, but we wanted to continue the test using the application rate that we had for the test. Things that we learned. Crude oil is manageable by all of the different fluorine-free foams that we tested. Every one of them were able to extinguish the fire at or below NFPA rates, and significantly less time than the NFPA timeframe. Application method made significant difference. So the more gentle the application method, the better the foam performed. But we've seen similar characteristics with AFFF of application method making a difference. Some special characteristics about crude that make it a little different. As you can see in the bottom video panel there, it looked like a black emulsion, and we were wondering how the fire was being controlled and extinguished, and really had no foam blanket on the surface. What we later found out, we went to Spain the next month and did some more testing with one of the manufacturers, and found out that we were getting film formation underneath that emulsive layer that was actually moving and extinguishing the fire, and then helping to cool the hot zone at the surface so that we could generate the foam blanket that continued to suppress vapors post-suppression. Foam quality has an impact on success. The more expansion, if we had higher expansion ratios, it generated general application, and it was easier to put the fire out. And again, we did get some slop overs and froth overs on the application, depending on how deep the foam traveled into the hot layer. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide, Miles. So what's the future for Class B foams? Transition is coming. You heard Martha talk about different regulations as they're coming in. We're seeing the similar regulatory pressure from around the world through the Stockholm Convention in Europe and Asia, through the EPA roadmap here in the US. So transition is coming. AFFFs are going to go away, and we are going to be faced with having to evaluate new Class B foams. New formulations can and have shown to be effective. Application rate is just one dimension of the suppression equation. There's been lots of talk about fluorine-free foams require 2 or 3 times the application rate. We've not seen that in the testing that I've been part of. We've been able to suppress and extinguish fires with fluorine-free foam at and below NFPA application rates with no problem. Foam quality is a key piece. So mechanisms of suppression are different with crude oil versus refined products. That hot zone layer with a multi-boiling point liquid makes it a very different way of suppression and needs to be considered as you're considering your transition. And screening can help prevent regrettable substitutions. As I said earlier, different manufacturers have approached the problem with different chemistry. So screening that chemistry and understanding it may not have fluorinated products, but still may be persistent, is a key thing to understand when you start to look for your replacement foam. So screening can help. And finally, cleaning your equipment whenever we want to remove the old foam. There will be residue. And one of the key things is understanding your cleaning process and how you test your durable equipment like fire trucks or fixed systems to ensure that your cleaning process was effective.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate all of the videos and insights. Certainly a lot to think about when considering transitioning from fluorinated foams to some of the alternatives. Now let's bring up Nicole. Nicole's got a background in engineering. And Nicole, we talked thus far, each of the presenters has talked about proactive measures. And I have a suspicion based on your background that you are going to be talking more on the reactive measures. Can you talk to us about some of the treatment options available?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, James, for the introduction. So ECT2 is just a subsidiary of Montrose. We've really pioneered the use of ion exchange resin for PFAS removal, and we've been treating PFAS impacted waters since 2016. So we really believe at ECT2 in designing solutions that reduce waste, which is really applicable with, as Martha mentioned, the new progression in listing PFOA and PFOS under CERCLA. So along with utilizing media to sequester PFAS, we also have developed a technology to be able to regenerate that media as well too. We have a full in-house R&D laboratory so that we can take your water sample specifically, understand the treatment options for that water and some of the co-contaminants that might be present, and then into developing, on-site piloting if necessary, and into full-scale systems as well. So on the right here, you can kind of see some graphics of what that looks like. So we have our piloting skid there, all the way up to our full-scale systems. When we talk about PFAS treatment, it's often a multi-stage process where we separate PFAS from the water stream, hopefully concentrate that PFAS up, and then bring it to the point where you're able to potentially couple a destructive technology as well too. So we're working on all of those steps so that we can cradle to grave and hopefully get rid of PFAS in the environment completely. So as you can kind of see here, we've treated quite a few gallons over the years, and that waste reduction is really due to that regeneration. Along with reducing waste, it's also more future-proof, as we like to call it. So as regulation comes out for either more stringent limits or perhaps new shorter chain analytes, you're able to meet those new unknown limits with just, changing that frequency of regeneration. So you can kind of see here, there's one of our modular systems on the right, which is a really great segue into the case study that I'll briefly walk this group through. Hopefully it's kind of an applicable case study for everyone, given that this is at a refinery site. So every state is looking at regulating PFAS a little bit differently. The state of Alaska has set a surface water discharge standard, which then affects a lot of municipalities that don't have the equipment or capability of removing PFAS often. So that then ends up affecting industries that are upstream, and in this instance was a refinery in the Fairbanks area. So you can see here, they're hit with this potential limit and, did quite a bit of work to understand where it was coming from and if they could mitigate it in their process. Unfortunately, since PFAS was so entrenched in the water they're using in their process and then also in their equipment, they came to the realization that they needed to move forward with a pretreatment step before sending to the city sewer. So on the bottom right, you can kind of see what that timeline looks like. So we really accelerated the timeline, both piloting as well as working through full scale design with them to make sure that the system was accessible, was going to arrive on site, turnkey, and give them the flexibility that they needed for this particular site. So this ends with the ultimate goal, which is to release non-detect PFAS to the municipality that's receiving their water. One other thing to note at this site, because this is wastewater, there's high levels of ammonia, chlorides, solids. Since it's in a lagoon, there's quite a bit of algae during the summertime as well too. So it was really important to design a very robust pre-treatment system so that the specialized ion exchange resin can do its job and sequester the maximum amount of PFAS at this particular site. So they've been running this system for close to 2 years now and have successfully been able to implement, a pre-treatment step into their process with pretty minimal operation needed. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Nicole. And that brings us to our last speaker of this afternoon, but certainly not least, and that is David. David is a chemist who has literally been working with fluorinated compounds for the last 20 years. And so to put a nice bow on the presentations that we've heard thus far, David, what can you share with the audience about lessons learned and where we're going?
Thanks, James, and thanks to everyone for sticking it out to the end of the presentation. I'm going to discuss some of the analytical considerations for PFAS. There's going to be a significant amount of money spent on PFAS issues, and a problem exists where we really don't have finalized and validated or EPA approved analytical methods for most of the matrices of concern. Yet regulatory agencies are requiring samples to be collected of all types. An example being the California refining PFAS orders, where matrices like groundwater and wastewater and soil are being requested for analysis. So the big picture, there's a ton of media hype around forever chemicals, putting pressure on politicians who put pressure on the regulatory agencies. And the regulatory agencies have been requesting industry to go sample things like surface water and soil and sediments, fish tissue. The problem is today, the only promulgated US EPA method is for drinking water and drinking water alone. The reason drinking water has an approved method was to support EPA's unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, or UCMR3, where the agency collected data for 6 PFAS compounds from public drinking water supplies. So what's the problem with the lack of EPA approved methods for other than drinking water? An obvious one is laboratories having significant differences in their procedures, leading to lack of comparability. And that's important when samples are being split between the regulated entity and the regulator. There's also a significant lack of accreditation and oversight by states. And the third issue is the analytical technique, which is referred to as LC triple quad or LCMSMS, used for PFAS. Most lab analysts only have a handful of years of experience with this technique, not entirely new to the environmental lab marketplace, but not very widely used until PFAS. I want to walk you through the timeline of analytical methods. As I indicated, EPA's current focus is on draft method 1633, a direct outcome of their interest in trying to develop a non-drinking water method. And so if we really look at prior to 2009, there was relatively few labs doing PFAS. The work was primarily focused on PFOA and PFOS using LC triple quad. And it wasn't really until 2009 that the first published method was available. And that was method 537 for 14 PFAS for drinking water. And as I said previously, that was to directly support the UCMR3 data collection effort for 6 PFAS. Later in 2019, EPA modified 537 to 537.1 with addition of 4 PFAS compounds. These techniques were using a surrogate internal standard quantitation approach. In 2019, EPA came out with the first non-drinking water method referred to as method 8327. That included identification of 24 PFAS and unfortunately used a direct aqueous injection technique, which differed widely from the solid phase extraction techniques that most labs were using. Subsequent, in 2019, EPA came out with a new drinking water method, 533, that included up to 25 PFAS compounds, and finally employed the gold standard of quantitation using isotope dilution. EPA also in 2021 came out with other test method 45 to address source emissions. And it's only in the last year or two where there became an emphasis on a 1600 series method, that being 1633, to address 40 PFAS in non-potable water, solid tissues, and other matrices. So we spent 13 years and we still don't have a promulgated method. Next slide. So I want to discuss draft method 1633 a little more. This method was first introduced in August of 2021, and then recently in June of this year, second revision to the draft came out. EPA has it posted on their Clean Water Act method page. It's undergone a single lab study. Environmental standards was retained by a bunch of stakeholders to review and comment on the method, and comment we did, roughly over 100 comments on the method. There are some significant inconsistencies and deficiencies in the method as it stands today, largely focused around branched and linear analysis as one example. The US DoD, who has significant PFAS liability due to the use of their AFFF, has been accrediting labs to the draft method, yet the multi-lab validation is still underway and is far from complete. What we hear is that US EPA anticipates a final rulemaking for method 1633 sometime in 2024. However, recently we came to learn that they may fast track the wastewater matrix and promulgation under the Clean Water Act for use in MPDS permits. Today, EPA EAD is requiring the OCPSF industry category to collect influent and effluent wastewater samples to support effluent limitation guidelines and standards for the manufacturers of PFAS. And we certainly think that it's premature given the fact the multi-lab validation study is not even completed at this point. So I mentioned OTM 45. I think that will have some importance as the agency is interested in collecting source emissions data as part of the answer to why the widespread and ubiquitous nature of PFAS. Reportedly, they're going to work on an ambient air method. And then lastly, you may have heard of draft method 1621, which is referred to as the total organic fluorine method. That's been published again on the Clean Water Act methods page, and it has only undergone a single laboratory study. Given the large number of PFAS compounds, this TOF method is certainly a proxy for trying to do total PFAS. However, there again are significant difficulties in this method, and EPA will readily admit that it's essentially a screening method. So we are no further, 13 years after the development of method 537 in a promulgated method for other than drinking water. And there's a significant amount of data collection going on as we speak. So I say, let's get a final method so that we can have comparable data.
At this time, I'd like to bring all of our panelists back out. And with the last 10 to 15 minutes that we have left, I want to get into some of our questions that we've gotten from our audience. But before we get into those questions, I'd like to pose a question to this team. And perhaps, Martha, you could lead off with your response. And that is the notion of how clean is clean?
Well, that's a great question, James. And one of the issues is that there are no standards right now. So there's nothing out there that tells us what limit we have to hit. And as we've seen, PFAS is rapidly evolving as far as how to deal with it. And I think at some point we will probably get some levels. My answer probably would have been different before the health advisories came out, but obviously we have to get as clean and close to zero as we can. And this means looking at everything, looking at your influent water to make sure that that is non-detect. And then doing testing throughout the process of the water, maybe doing wipe tests of equipment, doing equipment rinses and having those tested. And one of the things that this really brings in is the importance of having a lab that has a lot of experience in working with PFAS, because we need to make sure that the laboratory itself is not bringing any background levels into the process. So that part of it's also very important.
Yeah, I think, Martha, what, unfortunately, with the lack of standards, what's going to happen is the reporting limits or detection sensitivity of the method will end up becoming the de facto standards. And so, as you say, given the ubiquitous nature of PFAS, it's really important to make sure that you understand what the ambient background of whatever, environment you're in, because there's a high potential that just background will have detections, to these very sensitive part per trillion levels. So until standards are around, people are going to be looking at reporting limits and going, if it's not detect, I'm okay with it. But what's not detect mean today relative to, future regulations? So it will be fun for the next handful of years as we figure that out.
Yeah, and thank you. And Martha, you brought up the notion of influent water. Steve, I know we had a private conversation earlier before this presentation. And can you speak to an example specifically of that?
Sure, James. I had a colleague in Europe that had transitioned their equipment from AFFF to a fluorine-free alternative. And afterwards, they had used that fluorine-free alternative on an incident, and the regulator in that country had collected a sample and told them that their foam had PFAS in it. And what they found was the background in the water that they were using to make the foam solution had PFAS in it. So that influent water having background PFAS was detectable in the solution that was used. So understanding where your firefighting water comes from and what you're using to make foam solution is critical.
Yes, sir. Good point. Any other thoughts on the notion of how clean is clean before we kick it over to some of our audience questions? If not, let's go ahead. The first question I got here, and Angie, I believe it is to you, and it is, when a company is beginning to think about putting together an internal and external comms and safety plan, you went through a lot of slides there, but when we're putting that together, who needs to be involved in that decision-making process, and when should a company begin thinking about that?
Sure. So James, internally, a company would first want to consult with their EHS, environmental health and safety leadership team, their senior management team, and their legal teams. So I also highly recommend that you bring in an outside partner who is expert not only in PFAS chemicals, but in the development of these safety plans, so you can leverage their experience with this complex group of chemicals across industries. I also recommend that you do this now. So this is something that development of a PFAS program safety plan or a health and safety plan within your company related to these chemicals is something that it should be started immediately, because essentially you'll help yourself out by having this written documentation sooner rather than later, not only with the protection of your workforce and implementation of training programs, but in preventing future liabilities related to this chemical.
Good point. And Steve, can you speak to the external stakeholders that might need to be involved in plan development?
Yeah, thanks, James. One of the key members, I think, externally that you need to involve is your authority having jurisdiction for whatever facility you have that's changing from an AFFF to a synthetic fluorine-free. And you're probably going to have to educate that local jurisdiction or state jurisdiction on how you got to the selection of the fluorine-free foam that you choose, how you cleaned your equipment, and how you plan to use it, and what training you've gone through. So that external partner is going to be critical to your safety plan development.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or thoughts on that particular question before I take it to one last one? All right, with the short time available to us, let's get to the next question. And I think this one is probably best answered by you, Nicole. And it is, how does activated carbon compare to the treatment options that you discussed from ETC2?
Yeah, it's a great question, James. Thanks for teeing that up. So there's two major reasons that we at ECT2 like to utilize specialized ion exchange resins for PFAS removal. Carbon is an effective method, but you end up with a much larger footprint. So by utilizing a specialized resin, you can reduce that footprint 3 to 5 times, depending on the water. And then you also have an up to 20 times the capacity when it comes to how much PFAS you're able to sequester, depending on the analyte that you're specifically targeting. And by being able to take it one step further and regenerate that ion exchange media, you're able to concentrate that 1,000,000 to 1. So you end up with a huge waste reduction, and then hopefully you're setting yourself up to be able to actually destroy that PFAS stream as opposed to just moving it to another media.
Yeah, and can you speak to most of the industry partners that we are working with have strict, ESG goals? Is there anything you could say about the carbon and the footprint there in terms of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that large mass of carbon that you're using that you may or may not be able to regenerate, depending on the site and where you're getting the carbon from, there's a limit to how many times you can regenerate that carbon for PFAS removal. So you end up with a large amount of waste, of carbon waste, that then can negatively affect, the carbon offsets that you're trying to achieve for your internal ESG standards. So, this regenerable media or even a foam fractionation can be a great alternative to some of those carbon options.
Great point. Thank you very much. And that team wraps up the time that we've agreed to be together today. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy day. And then I want to thank our audience who have elected to spend a portion of their day with us. We regret that we weren't able to get to more of your questions this afternoon. We do, however, have contact information for each of the speakers in front of you. And if you wish, please feel free to reach directly out to the speaker of your choice. Thank you very much. Have a safe day. And also, I want to thank Environmental Leader for the opportunity and the venue to be able to present to this team. So with that, I want to thank you all. Safe travels for anyone on the road today. Thank you.